factors that are going to make for some craziness here. Maybe, I don't know. Annika's trying to sack out. We'll see what happens. So we've gotten the 5 stages, the psychosexual stages. The fascinating part here is this term fixation. And what Freud is saying is if the id has an impulse, let's say, suck your thumb because it feels good, so the id's saying suck that thumb, but the parents representing the superego at this point in time say, you must not suck your thumb because it is horrible, it's evil, it's bad. And you go, but I want to suck my thumb. And you try and suck your thumb and your parents slap your hand away, or they take your thumb out, or they paint some frickin' nail polish on there that tastes bad, whatever they do. You got this id saying, I want to suck the thumb. The superego saying, no, you must not do that, right? And now the ego has to try and figure out how to obey the superego, but satisfy the needs of the id. So, if during our childhood development that this represents a significant conflict, then we repress that conflict, we push that conflict down into the unconscious because it's too painful to deal with. What Freud says, though, is the conflict hasn't gone away. It's just been repressed, and it will manifest itself in other ways. So Freud would look at me, who, I smoked most of my life. I smoked cigarettes, not most, maybe about half my life, and I smoked a lot. And Freud might suggest then, well, you had a conflict at your oral stage, you repressed it, and now that you're an adult, you've manifested it in terms of smoking behavior. And that is now the pleasure of smoking, right? And notice that I can kind of beat up on my superego because I can say, I don't care. Oh, you're going to get cancer. And I said, oh, maybe not. I knew someone who's 96 years old, smoked every day of her life, and she never had cancer. So, then my rational ego is trying to explain to the superego why it's okay to fulfill my id level impulse. So anything that has to do with the mouth and the oral stage, right? So it could be smoking, it could be overeating, it could be drinking, alcoholism, right? All these might be explained by a psychodynamic theorist as the frustration of the id's urge, right? And now it's being played out over and over and over again as an adult. Now, let's make it super clear. This is the world according to psychodynamic theorists. Does it explain your adjustment challenge? Maybe, maybe not, right? And that's why the cool thing in this lecture is we learn all these different personality theories, because it puts us in control of being able to pick and choose what makes sense, what is consistent with the evidence that we're being presented in our behavior. Right. So we know. Have you ever referred to someone as anal because they're uptight and they're super organized and they're neat and they can't tolerate anything out of order? You say, "Oh my God, they're so anal." Well, this is coming from the anal retentive stage. That is, they tighten up that sphincter muscle. Right. They're going to control that poop. They're not going to let that poop out for nothing. Right. But notice now it's about control. Right. And so. Other people who just, let the sphincter muscle go, right? They're the term that we use is anal expulsive. And they're kind of disorganized. They're often late. They can't adhere to deadlines or calendars because they're letting it go, right? So go on down the list and figure those out. Limited utility, admittedly, but maybe some good explanatory power in a certain number of cases. Now, we're not done with Freud yet, and we've got to get weird if we haven't been weird enough with Freud. Freud said that there's largely an unconscious process by where boys desire their mother. They have an erotic attraction toward their mother, and the idea is that at the appropriate age, I now realize that my mom can't be the object of my affection, so now I channel that urge in a societally acceptable way so that I in fact seek out relationships with women, not my mother. Now, notice I'm going to talk in heterosexual terms when I'm talking Freud, because that's Freud's position. Again, it's easy to discredit Freud, and I don't think anyone's going to argue in the idea. But think about it, at least as a grain of truth, that if you ask young boys, 4 or 5 years old, say, who do you want to marry? They're going to say mom. because that is the woman in their life at that age, and it's been the woman in their life. And mom has, in a good parent-child relationship, mom has been everything to the child, right? So, but what Freud says is, man, young man, you have to understand that mom is like dad's, right? So you can't be chasing after mom because mom's already taken, she's married to dad, and so you need to go out and find your own woman, so to speak. This is the resolution of the Oedipus complex, right? Is to learn to identify with father. It's like, wow, well, if dad can get mom and I desire a woman like mom, maybe I should be like dad so then I can find a woman like mom. And that's kind of how the psychologic plays out in that, right? There's also the Electra complex, where young girls then in fact desire their father, but have to turn that outward to other men. So the identification then is the process of becoming like the individual, the same-sex parent typically, in this context. And of course, Freud, we're talking 1900, right? 1900 to through the 1920s, 30s, times were different then. So concepts of same-sex relationships were not, they were considered deviant back then rather than acceptable. And many people suffered because the id was driving them towards partners of their own sex, right? But the superego absolutely forbade that. And people had tremendous conflict over their sexuality back in the day. Well, and to this day as well, right? Depending on our upbringing, where we live, and our support. Now, let's get weird again. Let's talk penis envy. According to Freud, female desire to have this penis, right? So she becomes envious of males because they have a penis, right? And of course, then Freud offers at this point, and this explains a female's attraction to a male, because the male has the penis that she doesn't, so she can at least borrow one for a little while or something. No, that's my line. So, but then step back and be a little more metaphoric about it rather than a little more literal, and you say, well, shit. When you think about it, it's a man's world. Right? If we look at CEOs, if we look at rulers of countries, if we go back in time, it really has been the male who's held all the power. And what makes a male is the difference is the penis, right? Is the genitalia. So you can see where penis envy might in fact be a metaphor for envying the males in the good old boys club who have built the glass ceiling that limit the behavior of women, and also societies that dictate severely what's okay for women and what is not okay for women, and it's usually a different standard than what's okay for men, and boys. So metaphorically, it makes a lot of sense. Therapeutically, is it useful? Well, that's a whole other issue, and I don't go there too deeply because I'm not a clinical psychologist, right? I'm one of those wacky social psychologists. So homework 7 is going to explore Sigmund Freud's ego defense mechanisms. And that is, think about it, the id wants it, the superego says you can't have it. Now the ego's got to try and figure out how to make this okay without totally wigging itself out, without totally going nuts, right? With anxiety and guilt. So Freud developed these ideas of defense mechanisms, way that we resolve the conflict. And we can cast a lot of aspersions at Freud's thinking, elements of his theories, easy to do. But when you get to these frickin' defense mechanisms, these are rock solid, these are solid gold, and you observe them to this day. So Freud's a mixed bag. Some things spot on, other things kind of whacked out, right? But the defense mechanisms, and this is homework 7, right? Denial, regression, rationalization, fact, reaction formation, displacement, sublimation, and projection. Okay, so probably need a brief definition, and you can look further for other explanations. Denial is simply, I don't have a problem. I could smoke. I could quit smoking anytime I want to. So the id's driving me to smoke. The superego saying smoking's dangerous, right? And so that represents a conflict between it, but I can just deny the conflict. It's not really a conflict because I understand this, that smoking is bad, and I understand that I like smoking, and it's not really a problem because I can stop anytime I want. So I'm denying the conflict, and this is usually the easiest to employ. Now regression, right, is I can go back to some earlier stage to satisfy the need, where it was possible to satisfy the need. So while I'm quitting smoking, for example, I might regress to an earlier stage where now I put something in my mouth. I put a pen in my mouth, right? So I got the pen or the cap of the pen in my mouth, or I chew on the end of the pen, right? And that allows me to go back to a stage that's very similar maybe to like the binky. And you can see where this can be applied across a wide variety of contexts. Rationalization, I'll stick with the smoking example. I rationalize, that is now the ego's in full power, man, because that's where the rational thinking is. Go, well, you know, I don't smoke that many cigarettes a day. In fact, I read somewhere that if you smoke under 10 cigarettes a day, it's almost like not smoking at all as far as in terms of damage. And you know, in looking at my family, I got pretty good smoking genetics. That is, no one in my family has ever died from lung cancer. So I start spinning these yarns, so to speak. Very similar to something we talked about in self. Defense mechanisms for the self, do you remember? Which one do you think it is? I'm using self-serving cognitions as often, you know, coincides with rationalization. Now, reaction formation is a strange one, because what I do is I recognize something in myself, right? I have an impulse that I have to, I can't live with having that impulse, right? Because the superego just says, no way, dude, you are messed up. So what I do then is become like over the top against, especially those who display that impulse. So if a young man, let's say we've got a teenage boy, and I know this is a little graphic, but I don't know how else to explain it. We got a teenage boy, and through early adolescence, often it's embarrassing for young boys because they'll develop an erection, and they have like no freaking control over it, and it can happen like anytime and anywhere, and it can be quite embarrassing. But let's suppose that we have this young man now who has just finished soccer practice. He's in the shower with all his teammates, and suddenly Mr. Erection just pops up, comes and visits, and says, hello, here I am. And the young man, embarrassed about having an erection in the context of his naked teammates, you know, these guys, and he goes, oh my God, am I gay? And the superego says, no, you cannot be gay because that is wrong. Society says that's wrong, right? And now he's got this issue that he had this urge, which was not really an urge about anything in any event. And what does he do then? Well, to deny the urge, then he goes and he becomes homophobic. That is, he chooses then to derogate homosexuals in an attempt to distance himself from that, to assuage his fears, his anxieties that he might in fact be homosexual or latent homosexual. So reaction formation is developing a reaction, forming a reaction against the frightening aspect of the self. It's like hate towards some aspect of the self, but turned outward toward others so that it's safe to display, right? And non-damaging, because self-hatred can be damaging. So I turn my self-hatred into other hatred. Reaction formation, perhaps the most complex of the defense mechanisms. Displacement, right? Now, let's suppose I have an urge to be hostile or aggressive towards, let's say, my boss. My boss screws me over, right? And I really want the id is just saying strike out, punch his face, right? Bloody his nose, whatever it is. But the superego is saying, you can't punch your boss. You'll lose your job. You'll lose your income. You'll destroy your family. You can't punch your boss, right? But there are people I can be aggressive towards in my life. I can go home and I can yell at my wife. I can go home and spank a child over some minuscule infraction, right? Or the old saying, and better not do this, is you go home and kick the dog, right? That is, I take my impulse and I displace it onto a target that I believe to be safer than the target that it was originally intended toward. Are you exhausted yet? Okay. I'm going through these in some detail because it's pertinent to our assignment, right? Now, sublimation is when it all goes right. Sublimation is when I learn to satisfy the urge in a societally acceptable way. So I sublimate the urge, right? So in this case, I might feel aggressive, but aggression, it's okay to demonstrate aggression out on a sports field, right? Or I might adopt a surrogate for aggression. That is, I might go to the gym and work it off, hit the bag or whatever. You know, it may be some kind of pervert, right, that wants to peep in women's windows and look at naked women because the id is saying, oh my God, look at those naked women. Got to look at naked women. But the superego, you know, is saying, dude, you can't be a peeping Tom. You can't run around and peek in people's windows. You're going to get arrested, or even worse, as it happened here in the Hilltop where I live. Several years ago, we had the Hilltop creeper who was looking in windows and then breaking in, and women were waking up, finding this guy looking over them. And there's something about the Hilltop here. There's something called Hilltop justice. Neighbors observed the Hilltop creeper at some point. People are starting to look, and they just beat the shit out of him. And that's before they call the police, so that's usually the way things happen here in the Hilltop. Someone gets his clock cleaned, right, gets the shit beat out of him, and then we call the police, right? I don't know, he must have fallen when he was looking in that window. Don't know what to say. Right? So sublimation, finding a way to do it the right way. What's the right way to do it? Well, if I want to look at naked women and I don't want to get beaten up and I don't want to get arrested, maybe I should get myself a nice camera, set up a little studio, and advertise in the paper for figure photography or some such. And notice, if you're a photographer and women want to disrobe in front of you, you can take their picture, and it's thought of as a skill rather than a perversion. So I sublimate it. I figure out some frickin' way to do it in a societally acceptable manner. And Freud said this is the best way to go for any of us, is to learn how to sublimate. Learn how to satisfy an urge, you know, adapt the urge to the circumstance in a way that is societally superego acceptable. Projection? Well, projection is when we accuse the other of what we're feeling. So if you ever said, why are you so, you look angry. What's wrong? You look angry. And a lot of times when we say that about another person, we project that onto them. Maybe it's our own anger. And notice, this goes back to the idea of the projective test. Someone is just sitting there ambiguously, not really showing any expression. I'm angry, but then I ask them why they are angry. I'm projecting my repressed anger onto an ambiguous target, typically. So, for homework 7, 4 people please, which is what our teams are basically, right? And you know, in this, you're going to have to answer all the questions. So if you only got 3 people on your team, suck it up. You're going to have to work a little harder. You're going to have to answer all the questions as if you were 4, right? Choose 2 of the previous defense mechanisms. 2 folks create a situation, a scenario for each. In this scenario, an imaginary person is in conflict. So, create an ego-driven, an id and superego conflict of some type. That's the first part, to understand the conflict nature. So, create an imaginary person. And if you want to use a real conflict, right, then use a real conflict of one of your teammates. But say it's imaginary, if you will, and that protects their privacy, right? Clearly describe the conflict in terms of impulse and constraint, that is id and superego. Then the other 2 folks apply the defense mechanism used in the conflict and describe how it's worked, right? So what do we ended up with work product? I'm looking for then 2 scenarios, and I'm looking for the application of 2 defense mechanisms to the scenarios. And I want it to be challenging, and that's why I'm having one pair create the scenarios, and then the other people looking at it and saying, oh, okay, yeah, this defense mechanism likely applies. So for you creators, be cool, be kind, think in terms of the conflict and the mechanism, right? And then the other 2 are essentially applying or guessing the mechanism. And I think once you get through that, you'll understand this pretty darn well. So I'm going to end part 2 now. Here is kind of a logical place to end it, and we'll go to part 3. We're going to talk about Carl Jung.